Alright, it's May 18th. Sunday, let's see where we are in the season. It's been an interesting one to say the least. A lot of really hot weather, followed by very, very cold weather. So, where are we? We finally made it through silver tip, green tip, half-inch green, tight cluster, pink, bloom. We're moving through bloom. Probably not much left. There's a few flowers here and there in Geneva, but now we're moving in to the petal fall. And this is the point in the year where I would say we'd start implementing the single-site fungicides. They're generally the safest group to use at the thinning period, the 10 to 15 millimeter, and at petal fall, mainly because there's little indications of toxicity. And this is also the time you'll see that I sort of move Captan out. If you had to do anything around this point, I would say use up the last of your mancozeb, or you can put in a little bit of sulfur, but be careful with sulfur because it can thin the crop as well. And as we'll sort of be moving in back into the summer, after second or third cover, we'll pick back up with Captan, and it will be part of the types of rotations that we would bring into the summer. And you'll still see I have some purple arrows coming in to third and fifth cover, right around in there, and that's really to get these other things. New players are coming onto the field. Cedar apple rust has been here for a little bit, but now we'll be seeing things like apple blotch and powdery mildew throughout the rest of the season. Now, if you want to stick to avoid the sort of multi-site protectants and stick to biopesticides, and you're still willing to use single-site fungicides, you've got a couple of different options. You'll see I mostly replace those, and it's all a matter of when do you use the green one, the biopesticide, whenever it's least rainy. And at that point, if you have to put something in the tank with the single-site fungicide, you can put a biological in as well. It becomes a little more expensive in that case, but you're not mixing it with mancozeb then. So what are we doing? Petal fall to second cover. Keep an eye out if you have any more ascospore ejections. And they may be ending. You'll see very quickly that most primary season's over with. So now we'll be moving on to a different metric other than like 15% ascospore ejection. About 5 days or about 1.5 inches of rain since the last time you applied a material. And if this happens, it's time to bring in one of these other fungicides. 7, 11, 3, and 52. Some examples might be Miravis, Flint Extra, Stevia is your 3, Axios is your 52 to get these. They'll do a lot of different things. Axios is only labeled on scab and mildew, but the pantheon of them will do pretty good on apple scab. I'll put 7s for that. The group 11s, the Flint, really wonderful on powdery mildew now. The group 3s used to be great on powdery mildew, but they're generally a little more water insoluble, making them a little better on apple scab and fantastic on mildew. Axios will do those too as well. Also, we'll be moving into trying to manage apple blotch. Do I think apple blotch will be a big problem this year? I don't think so. It used to be called Marsanina, but my colleagues, Surgeon and Carey, had this more appropriately classified with diplocarpin and given it a new name. I don't think they used that name themselves. But they did publish a paper telling everybody else to do it, to use that new name. All right, well, what if you have less than 15% ejection? You get no rain at all. Captan plus mancozeb. You can use the Captazeb for a little while longer. We're approaching the 75-day or 80-day PHI window, pre-harvest interval window for mancozeb. Use them up now while you've got them, but watch out on your early early maturing cultivars that you don't end up putting mancozeb on a little too late. It's a nice combo of the 2.5 with the 3 pounds of mancozeb 75. Does a good job of sticking, good job of spreading around. Or a biopesticide if it's really light. Some nice products would include things like Stargus, EcoSwing, Double Nickel. All the liquid formulation ones tend to go on a little more easier to use. If you need something a little more beastly, we're recommending, or if you're going full organic, trying out the Oso works pretty well on a lot of fungal diseases, or the Howler. It makes sort of an early stage chemical analog of fludioxonil, which is a post-harvest fungicide that does quite well in almost all systems. It's a pretty potent chemistry, little to no resistance. We don't really have it in season for apples. We do have it at the end of the season, and this is sort of your way to sort of get it natural levels of that type of stuff. But be careful with it. Don't overspray it, because you can select for cross resistance to a biological, which is tend to be unheard of. In this case, that's some of the things that Howler does. And, if it's less than, just stick with one of your nice liquid formulations. If you ever spray a biological and you see it in the bottom of the tank, that's probably not the one for you. I can spray any one of these examples that I've mentioned, and they pretty much clean themselves out. So let's move on to fire blight. What is happening with fire blight now? We've done through bud break, we've done green tip, everyone put their copper on, we moved into pre-bloom pink, peroxidine calcium, maybe with a little bit of SARS. The SARS will be coming in to the next phase as we head into the petal fall component. We passed the antibiotics, and anything that will sort of kill or burn things on the surface is almost over with right now. You shouldn't be applying too many antibiotics or biologicals unless you have some rat tail bloom. But what we want to focus on now are the PGRs and the defense inducers, those systemic required defense inducers right there. And now we'll be putting them on at petal fall, and again about 2 more weeks after petal fall. What you're trying to do is slow down any vigorous growth that we might have from a lot of rain or a lot of nutrition, such that they aren't growing very robustly when it's blisteringly hot. You want to try to get them to terminal bud set, and hope that when terminal bud set comes, it's not very, very hot weather in the part of the year preceding it. If we have hot weather during thinning, you could end up exacerbating some shoot blight problems. I've often been a little concerned that some of the maybe injury posed by the chemical thinning, how the fruit gets killed and removed, could be predisposing ourselves to some shoot blight, particularly in really, really hot weather. So, close bloom, petal fall, 6 ounces per 100, assuming a very small tree, or 2 ounces per 100 plus 1 ounce per 100 of acyl or benzoyl methyl or Actigard. And then do that at petal fall, and 14 days later, you'll have about 3 of these things on right now. It won't slow down the growth, but the 2 of these things together will slow it down a little bit, really pop up those defenses. It'll thicken the parenchymal cell walls, preventing the fire blight, even if it gets infected, to not expand and invade the tissues and cause this sort of massive tree death that one might see in a small, high-density planting. It's quite disheartening, to say the least. And it just sort of really stops and slows down this systemic invasion of tissue. Won't stop the initial infections, but if infections run out of steam because they can't go any further, you just kind of won the day, if you will. And in theory, if you overdo it, it can slow the growth of trees, but at some point, do you want them to die? You're sort of balancing, trying to reach the top wire with keeping them kind of stunted a little bit during the hot fire blight weather. If you do need to prune, what do you do? If you start seeing shoot blight, that's not great, but it can happen. Look for a cold, overcast, dry day. Hasn't rained that much today in Geneva, and it's kind of cold and overcast outside. Great time to prune. Make sure that you do this when you get your first cold, dry day. Try to go into at least 12 inches into last year's growth, healthy tissue. You can kind of see the parts of the plants where they've been growing from year to year, and sort of remove anything that's in the new growth and cut about 12 years into last year's growth. If you have a really small tree and the infection has moved into the scaffold, just remove it and replant. You can try a rescue program. It can be kind of tricky. In this particular instance, if you want to go for a rescue program, you'll put out 6 to 12 ounces per 100 of peroxidine calcium. Wait 5 days for it to try to work. If it's very sunny and the plants are moving, it might work fairly quickly. And then you prune. And then you'll probably need to do this again, because the act of pruning will re-stimulate growth and more issues. So what else is happening now? We've talked mostly about fire blight and apple scab, but what other things are out there, and what am I finally starting to worry about now? Other key fruit diseases. Cedar apple rust. This is an interesting disease. Unlike fire blight and apple scab, it is only monocyclic. It means it only has one cycle, and it can't keep reinfecting throughout the year. Like apple scab and fire blight can keep reinfecting your apple trees once the first infection sets in. But this one, if you stop at any point along the cycle, you're done for the whole year, and all is well. 2 hosts involved are apple and eastern red cedar. This isn't normally part of the cedar tree. These are galls that are actually part of the fungus. They're quite showy, and they have beautiful orange gelatinous looking tentacles. or tendrils, if you call them. They're actually a spore-bearing structure that makes teliospores. It's a type of spore that will then infect the apple. Well, it actually makes a basidiospore, and that spore makes and that infects your apple. And they're infecting right around now, wet weather during early bloom, moving into the types of periods that we'll see now. You could start to see infections of fruit, much like on the little fruitlets, and probably in the coming weeks, depending on how far along. The infections will occur earlier on, closer to bloom and around petal fall, but you could start seeing them now during later leaf and fruit development. And you'll see they're like little orange spots and pustules. These are the different stages of cedar apple rust that will actually, at this point, these will infect the cedar, but you don't care because your fruit's already ruined. You're really looking after those cedar infections floating through the air around bloom to petal fall, coming for your apples. And in that particular instance, if you see cedar trees and you don't want them in your planting, just remove them. And as you could well imagine, once the fruit become distorted and filled with the pycniospores and other brightly colored spores on the bottom side of the leaf, the esiospores, they'll pretty much unmarketable. And there is some resistance, but it's largely undocumented. We did some studies a while back in an organic block with Terrence and Art Agnello. We had a lot of different cultivars, and I looked at rust management in those, and I found that some of them are absolutely resistant to rust and didn't get any at all, and others were loaded. How does it happen? You manage those early infections from the cedar at bloom to petal fall. These cause the trouble. And then if you stop that, you're done for the season. At this point, as you can see, if you start to see the pycniospores and the esiospores on the leaf, we'll show those in a bit. You're kind of already done, but your crop is ruined. All right, what works really well against this? The group 3, that's why I was sort of allowing or recommending group 3 fungicides in the previous coming weeks because they're really fantastic against rust and cedar apple rust. And we don't have enough pressure from this disease to generate concerns about resistance yet. Of the protectants, mancozeb is fantastic against rust. And as we lose or curtail mancozeb and maybe not apply as many group 3s, you could start to see rust make a comeback and cause more damage. If you put this in combination with DMIs and rust, it works quite well. Around the time that we've been transitioning out of various positions in the Hudson Valley, I used some of Dave Rosenberger's rust blocks, and we did some trials, and it was just shocking to see how well mancozeb and DMIs work together and just wipe it out. Timing, tight cluster to second cover. That's why I mentioned a couple of different times. Maybe you swing in the group 3s if you have rust. So this is the pycniospore. These spores come from basidiospores that will then infect your apple trees. So what's a basidiospore? It's kind of like an ascospore, except it's from a mushroom type family of fungi. So these they'll infect, go through the bottom side of the leaf, and then they'll make a really gross tubular structure that has different spores that are to infect cedar. You don't care about what these are infecting, but the problem is the damage is already done. So you're really targeting that tight cluster, second cover. It seems to be the best timing. If you have cedar and you don't like it, remove it. And here's a cute little example of how the whole thing works. Typically these galls with these teleal horns, as they're called, they're kind of gelatinous and jelly-like. I wouldn't eat one. They don't make you sick, but they're kind of gross. And they're so prevalent that they're even used as ornaments on Christmas trees. And I've seen them in German Christmas ornaments before. Some person must have thought it was part of a decoration. Nope, it's just a pathogenic fungus. And they will erupt in the spring from the cedar galls. And if you're on main campus on Ithaca, over near behind Mann Library in the Botanical Garden, you can actually go visualize and see what these things look like as they're wildly unmanaged. And inside them are these things called teleospores, kind of like a precursor to an ascospore. It's just real different than the ascomycetes we tend to deal with. These are basidiomycete type pathogens. Make this thing that looks like a little caterpillar under the microscope with these little tiny basidiospores on it. Very similar. They don't eject, they don't fly too far, but they can be carried some. Infection develops on the leaves and fruit during spring. They make little pycnia. These pycnia are the things that are ruining your fruit. As one can visualize, sort of orange, raised, bumpy. They make the fruit dismembered. They'll be sort of damaging the pedicels. And then they form on the upper surface, and then they fertilize one another and travel to the bottom and become a type of mycelium that you would find in a mushroom that you'd eat in the grocery store, weirdly enough. But in this case, they make this strange Ecia. Looks like a long tube, so if you see a bunch of spots under the leaves that look like they have little hairs out of them, they're actually hollow, and they're filled with these Ecia and Eciaspores. These fly out, and then in the summer start reinfecting the cedar again. They'll make galls. Galls become dormant over winter, and you need 2 years to mature a gall. So if you're like, what if I just cut the galls out of the tree? Yeah, you can do that. It's just very labor intensive. But they need 2 years to mature and make the gelatinous mess that causes trouble next year. So in terms of overview with rusts, this is what we're looking at. Copper, we're still doing that for mostly apple scab. But this is where if you do a full mancozeb program, you can really knock that down. And another reason I continue to recommend mancozeb with the single-site fungicides into the bloom to petal fall and then coming up to the second cover is you really get that good rust control. And particularly the 7-Elevens, not so much, but those group 3s really can completely remove rust. As we move away from these fungicides, we may see trouble. What else is trouble? A lot of people have already been worried about apple powdery mildew. How does it start? Well, it starts from primary infections. Now, what we're kind of looking for here, these are from last year. This is a shoot tissue that was infected the previous year. This is a blossom cluster. These buds might have been infected the previous year. The shoot bud might have been infected the previous year. They're going to burst forth into this nasty deformed mess of powdery mildew. This one's on Ida-Red. I think this one's on Jonah Gold. And what these things do is they will sporulate in the season in the next couple of weeks, and when they do sporulate, they'll start causing these other secondary infections that will curl the leaves, sporulate again. They can even make spores that damage the fruit. The Canidia can't infect the fruit and resporulate, but they can tear it up and make a webbing type russet on it. They'll stunt shoots, they'll curl all the leaves up, they get terrible photosynthesis, and it can be pretty bad type materials. And so if we're spraying for powdery mildew before shoots and blossom clusters were fully out, you're not doing too much. I mean, in theory, the fungicides could penetrate into those buds and do stuff, but for the most part, what you want to do is manage it well, this season, so that next year you don't see this stuff at all, if you will. And so what really gets bad is warm, dry periods in the spring and summer. Well, we have cool and wet. If it generates a lot of humidity, you'll still have powdery mildew problems. But we're having a lot of alternating weather that's very strange. It's either hot, 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 or cold, cold, rainy. And sadly, a lot of the cultivars that we like to eat and grow and people like to buy often are powdery mildew sensitive. There's not a lot of resistance for powdery mildew breeding in that sort of instance. There's not a lot of work being done on that. And if you let this get out of control, if you don't apply fungicides kind of from now, petal fall, into the summer a bit, this stuff will just rage unchecked and everything can look kind of white and kind of a mess. I don't really think there's a lot of fungicide resistance for the most part, but I have noticed that over time, the group 3 fungicides used to be extremely effective, particularly the more water-soluble ones. Those have fallen out of favor because they're not as effective against apple scab, rime, and the rally. They tend to do a little better on powdery mildew. They would just clean it up like no one's business. But recently, even in some of my really disgusting powdery mildew blocks where the trees kind of look like I sprayed them with fake Christmas snow, those aren't working that well. What tends to work really well for me right now, the group 3 fungicides, also less effective, but I think they're one of the better choices that I find in really intense mildew blocks. Number 7s aren't as strong, but there are a couple that are pretty decent in the mix. Some of the materials aren't too bad. We'll look at some of the different fungicides and how they look. Sulfur always is going to work. Great option for powdery mildew. Should you use labor to cut any of this stuff out? I wouldn't. I think it's too expensive. You do a good job of managing it this year, you'll have less pressure next year to deal with. How does this silly thing work? Right now, you can prune, and this is kind of sort of a diagram of how the different things will affect your powdery mildew, if you will. For the most part, you can do a little bit of sanitation, but I really wouldn't wouldn't waste my time with it. But in theory, what it will do is it'll take your disease progress curve that might go from powdery mildew incidence from 0 to 100 and just keep shifting it down. What about the silvertip copper? Does that do anything? Anything that would kill mildew inside the buds. And any fungicide will kill powdery mildew if it comes in contact with it. Even water can pop the powdery mildew spores. Do I think copper is doing anything? I don't know. We had a study that was looking at late season applications of single site fungicides with stuff like Regulate, and that seemed to reduce a bit the amount of carryover inoculum into the previous year. It was kind of a challenging experiment to run. But early on, sulfur is really great, and if you can get sulfur deep down in the buds early on, like a delayed dormant application of sulfur, like one might do for berry crops, you can kind of knock that stuff out. The idea is you just want to keep shifting that curve till you're not dealing with as much as, maybe not 95% powdery mildew on all the leaves, maybe more like 33. And this is kind of typically where it starts, overwinters inside bud tissue. In some of the southern states, it's reported to winter as a structure called a chasmathesia. It's kind of a lot like the pseudothesia with ascospores. But up in New York, we think it's overwintering as basic conidia. And when these things grow and break bud, they'll make this deformed growth shoot, or a gross flower cluster. Really depends on the cultivar. My Jonah Golds make the shoots, my Ida Reds make the gross flower clusters. And then this is where the problem starts. This is where the real inoculum gets ramped up, because these will fly over and infect your terminal leaves, which are just now growing and developing. They'll make new powdery lesions, which will keep over and over infecting and causing new lesions, and then eventually they'll infect the developing buds that are developing in season and can even infect your terminal bud on a crop, slowing it down and preventing you from getting fire blight, but making sure that you get one of these awful deformed shoots covered with powdery mildew next year. And they can make a web-like netting on the fruit, which is not good. So what are we doing in this case? If you get to the secondary stage, what we're actually doing to get mildew down now is we're trying to stop infections of developing bud tissue, and we're suppressing these secondary disease cycles. And so you can kind of think about, with every successive infection, the curve becomes exponentially more steep. And what we do, if we put on protected fungicides or single site fungicides from bloom to second cover, we're taking the steepness of that curve and we're flattening it down so that it doesn't rise so quickly. You want that curve so flat that by the time you hit terminal bud set and those things aren't growing, powdery mildew is mostly over with by then. Just like fire blight, it really needs a living host. That curve is so flat, you're like, oh, I only got 10%, I'm ramping up at 10. You're not going to get a big impact on your overwintering or photosynthesis for the rest of the summer. A couple things to keep in mind: Captain and Mango Zab do nothing. I usually keep them in there as a check. It's kind of like almost as bad as having no fungicides at all. Things to not really worry about. Single sites are really, really good. There's a couple new powdery mildew fungicides coming to market. I don't know if Quintec and Gatton are yet labeled for apple powdery mildew, but they are quite fantastic in our recent trials and look like really up-and-coming superstars. A lot of times, if you're a superstar for powdery mildew, you don't end up doing a lot of scab control. But I've even seen scab control on my Gatton only and Quintec only treatments, but they're not marketed for that. So there might be something that you put on specially for powdery mildew. Sulfur is always great. It's the only protectant fungicide that you want to do. Captan Mancozeb are not effective. And then when you're going for these single sites, I really go for bloom, particularly if you have a variety that's bursting forth with powdery blighted blossom clusters. I can already see a bit of powdery mildew on my Evercrisps right now as well, and our UV block, not necessarily on the UV treatments, but I see it in the block, and a little bit on the Snapdragon. So it's out there. I don't see a lot of primary in there, so there may be smaller buds that are breaking as terminals are going and are sort of damaged with powdery mildew. Every 7 to 10 days from bloom to third cover. I mean, push this out there, particularly if we have a season that's kind of hot, dry, and humid, which means it's going to be hot and it's constantly raining and generating a lot of humidity. The SDHIs are okay. DMIs and QRIs are generally the best. All right. There are models that just don't really do much. If you have bad mildew, Keep that sulfur on early, delay dormant. If you ever do a liquid lime sulfur fish oil type thing for thinning, you're probably just punching that powdery mildew right in the gut. And then the 11 and 3 are probably some of your best bets. Taking a look at all the different fungicides that we have for this type of stuff. Axios, I've seen pretty decent control in powdery mildew. I've only had it 1 year. Group 9s aren't great. The Group 11s are fantastic. Gem is another Group 11 that is quite good on powdery mildew. Pristine will work as well, but it's the sort of equivalent to Maravon. But if I was on Long Island, maybe I would use Pristine over Maravon. But Luna Sensation, the only reason they're great and they work amazing is they're just not allowed on Long Island. Tesseris, I've had some great luck with powdery mildew there. A little bit with Miravis as well on those. Coming into the DMIs, I found Zevius pretty decent, but it behaves a little more like Spire Super. These tend to be a little more water insoluble, but the Rally and the Rhyme, pretty solid. The Rally being allowed on powdery mildew. It behaves a little more like the older ones. These are very highly water soluble fungicides, and they really get in there and pop those spores, but they're not going to be as strong against apple scab. Something to think about. All right, now we'll do the forecast in a bit, and let you get back to your week.